For my final project, I wanted to focus on music and horror films because I'm a music major and I love seeing how music really applies to other things that I'm passionate about, and I think that horror films really wouldn't be the same without music. So let's get started. In the foreword to his book, Music in the Horror Film, Listening to Fear, Neil Lerner said, "Human anatomy lacks the equipment necessary for actually closing our ears. There is no ear lid as there is an eyelid, and a finger only dampens, not obliterates sound waves. And perhaps that says something about the fundamental utility of hearing in our development as a species." So what I think is really interesting about this is that music can touch you kind of on a instinctual level, and I think that that's what a lot of horror films do, is they kind of talk to your instincts. And another thing that I found really interesting was a quote by Brigid Cherry, and she said, "Certain musical cues have thus become tropes of the genre and are thus subconsciously recognized by the audience, creating certain feelings of horror and expectations of dread." So I thought this was really interesting because in music, there are certain techniques that are used to create different feelings in the listener. So there is what's called a major chord, a minor chord, an augmented chord, and a diminished chord. And these things are something that we're taught in music theory our freshman year as music majors. And the way you learn them is kind of how they sound. So a major chord has a certain interval in it, but it sounds happy. It sounds like most things that you might hear on the radio. Minor chords sound sad. They're a little more melancholy. Diminished chords sound scary. So they're a lot crunchier, they're a lot closer together, and they are dissonant, which is meant to kind of create this sense of anticipation where you wait for a resolution. So diminished chords almost always lead back to major chords because major chords are happy. Augmented chords sound odd. They're out of place. They're really not used very often. Diminished chords have become kind of the poster child for horror films. So I think that's what Cherry is trying to say when she says that certain musical cues have become tropes of the horror genre. And, there's kind of a formula that a lot of people will follow. The inclusion or omission of music in horror films is used to create two main effects. Classical soundtracks often accompany scenes of violence or horror, while silence can either create a sense of apprehension or quiet horror. Horror films don't have quite the same effect without music. I wanted to look at music in horror films through a couple different lenses. So first I want to look at movies with horror film scores that were written specifically for that movie that have either become iconic or classic. So we'll be looking at Halloween and Psycho. And then secondly, I'd like to look at movies that use silence really well, something that's a little less common, but for that section we'll look at Let the Right One In and The Ring. And then the last section, I want to do a little bit of a test and see if horror movies are as scary without the sound. I have a couple videos of jump scare compilations from The Conjuring and from Insidious, so we'll take a look at those first with sound and then without sound. So I'm going to start with the movie Halloween, and this is the scene where Michael Myers is chasing Laurie through her house, and she finds the bodies of her friends. So here we go. Make sure my sound is turned up. So it's quiet right now. The body appears on the screen at the same time as the sound. And you hear Laurie's kind of groaning. It's like that constant alarm. This right here is the use of dissonance, which makes you want resolution. And there's that loud noise that makes you jump. And the scream. And then they start playing that Halloween theme. Oh, she's crying. But there's Michael Myers' face, and there's that sound again. Which is... Okay, so we got the screaming, we got the falling. And there's the piano riff. And I think this is really interesting because it reminds me of a heartbeat. That staccato rhythm. So I think that's enough of that scene right there. You get the silence leading up to the bodies being shown on the screen, which is accompanied by the sound, and that sound is what makes your heartbeat spike. Another quote from Bridget Cherry, which I think really applies to Halloween, is that music in particular can create sensations of tension, alarm, and anxiety in the viewer, and horror film music can often be discordant, pulsing with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Long, deep notes can create states of tension. Staccato rhythms indicate a raising in anxiety levels. I think that's really applicable for the scene in Halloween because you get that short little piano rhythm, the staccato one, where Michael Myers is chasing Laurie through the house, and that kind of makes you anxious, but then you also get those lower notes later in the scene when she's running away from him, and I think that also creates a state of tension. So now I want to watch the iconic shower scene from Psycho. Hopefully we'll be able to watch most of this. Right now you just have a little bit of background music. This could be scary, it could be just to amp up the fact that it's a horror movie. And something's off here. So she's just stolen money from her boss. And now she's gonna go take a shower. So we get just those mundane sounds. The music stops, which is a clear sign that something's gonna happen. This was so unprecedented. Alfred Hitchcock killing off his leading lady in the beginning of the movie. These are just everyday sounds, so there's no music going on. Charlie's picture notice. I like this frame because the audience can see what Marion can't. And that silence is still leading up to the shrieking violins. The music in this also accompanies her screams, just like in Halloween. And here, we're back to the lower strings. Those lower sounds, which are like, she's dying, she's sliding down the wall as the pitch is sliding down in the music. Something terrible just happened. Fun fact, they used chocolate syrup to make the blood in that scene, which I always thought was kind of cool. Psycho was one of the first horror movies I ever watched. I watched it in a film class in high school, and I always felt like those screeching violins, they always reminded me of an alarm, which, you know, is supposed to wake you up. It's supposed to heighten your senses and bring you out of sleep. So I always thought that was interesting, and especially the fact that they are coordinated with the stabbing. The stabbing is paired with the shrieking violins, so I think that's really interesting. So, and then the brass comes in, and it's kind of foreboding, you know, it's eerie. It's like it gets lower and lower and lower, and it's like this denouement of the scene where she's dying and you know she's dying. In Music in the Horror Film, Listening to Fear, Neil Lerner actually quoted Carol Clover in a passage about Psycho. Clover said, "The shower sequence of Psycho shocks at the auditory as well as the visual level, preceded by an ominous silence, the unadorned natural sounds of Marion's preparations. The attack triggers the sound of shrieking violins, whose hammering thrusts duplicate both the stabbing action of the diegesis and the editorial shattering of the image. Some viewers claim that they are more disturbed by the music of horror movies than the images, and that they cover not their eyes but their ears in the scary parts." Psycho really marked the beginning of an era in musical scores for horror film. I think it's such a perfect example of how music can accentuate a horror movie, but also how sound can accentuate a horror movie. Okay, so let's look at Let the Right One In. I have the English subtitles on, so this is interesting because it starts with music already playing. It's upbeat. This was a pretty happy scene at first. There's just kids playing in a pool. So Oscar has been constantly tormented by these kids.
Vet du vem jag är? Bra. Då fattar du. Vi ska ha en liten tävling nu. Du stannar under vattnet i 3 minuter. Fixar du det så gör jag bara en liten rispa. Fixar du det inte så stick ut ena ögat på dig. Ett öga för ett öra, va? Okej?
Men det går ju inte.
Det är ditt problem.
So here the music ends. This is how you know something bad's gonna happen, which is very opposite from the music that we have looked at before.
Passa på att andas.
And the sound that we've seen before.
5, 4,
You can still hear him breathing right now.
2, 1.
And now things are really silent and all you hear are the bubbles. There's this sense of apprehension. And you just hear the bubbles.
Jimmy.
Håll käften! Håll käften, sa jag!
This makes it almost more real. So there you hear some banging in the distance, and this muted screaming. But I think this is a really good example of how the silence makes the visuals more important and more disturbing. There's nothing to distract you from the horror of what's happening. And you're just left with the aftermath. That quiet aftermath. So now, of course, we are looking at silence in horror films, and I think that Let the Right One In is a great example of that. There's barely any music in it. And I don't know if this is different because it's a Swedish film and it's not Hollywood, but it's very quiet. I found it very kind of eerie, quietly disturbing, but not necessarily scary. It's not one of those movies where you're jumping out of your seat because of the jump scares. It's just that it makes you think and it makes you uncomfortable. So what I love about this scene is that you don't actually see any of the gore. You have this arm that floats down into the water after you see this disembodied head that floats down behind Oscar. But there's no music. It's just this muted sound of underwater. And it's kind of opposite from the musical scenes we've looked at. So the fact that the music stops when the horror begins, rather than the silence leading up to the music, where the music coincides with the horror, the music leads up to the silence, and the silence coincides with the horror. It almost makes it more real. Bridget Cherry said that an absence of sound can be used to create effect, often contrasted with sudden loud noises or a cacophony of sounds. I know that this movie is not an example of leading up to a cacophony of sounds, but I do agree that the absence of sound here creates a very distinct effect, and it's very different from the effect of loud violins like in Psycho. So the last time I used this scene for my scene analysis, I did the whole scene, but I wanted to focus on just this part with Samara and her mother at the well, because this is where the silence starts. So, go.
Isn't it beautiful here, Samara? So peaceful. I know things will get better.
So all you hear is the plastic around Samara's head. And that lurching.
It was you.
The lurching kind of makes it more real. And this is where the sound starts, and it's not even really music. It's just kind of sounds like water or air or wind. So that difference between Samara in the well and Samara's mother. Samara in the well and Samara's mother killing her, the difference between those two. Like I said with Let the Right One In, it almost makes what's happening on screen more important. Because there's no sound to detract from what's happening on the screen, it's more real. You're not as removed from the scene as you would be if there was a soundtrack. Like I said earlier with Let the Right One In, I think that quiet scenes in horror films almost make the horror more realistic. I found a post from a horror fan looking for more quiet horror movies, and she said, "The reason I find silence to be so effective is that it's the one soundtrack that's real. It's everywhere. It's always loudest when we're alone, or the batteries on our music players or phones run out, or when you're at work and you have to focus on the task at hand. There's no rousing score, no expensive Hollywood composer there to either scare you or amp you up." I felt like this was very, very applicable to this scene in The Ring, and I did a scene analysis on this scene earlier in the year. Something we've talked about is the idea that mothers are supposed to protect their children. They're not supposed to kill their children, and that makes this so quietly disturbing, so wrong on an instinctual level, that the music doesn't need to be there. The silence almost fits the horror in this film, because it's the sound of the plastic bag around Samara's head and her mother's labored breathing and just that whispering. And it makes it so much more realistic, because you can imagine that happening in real life. If this murder was happening in real life, there wouldn't be a soundtrack. So I found this video of The Conjuring jump scares only. and they're isolated, and I don't think we necessarily have to watch all of them, but I'd like to watch them once with sound and then once without sound, and we'll see how they're different. So, hopefully I don't jump too much, and it's not as embarrassing for me. There's an example of the music stopping. That made us jump a lot the first time we saw it. See, I've seen this like 6 times, and it still gets me.
Who's ever down there to lock you in now?
Listening to her fall down the stairs makes me so uncomfortable. Okay, we're done. I'm gonna go back to the beginning. See? It's not as scary without the sound. Sound actually makes you kind of uncomfortable. So all you're doing is watching somebody on screen freak out. This scene, see, it's still uncomfortable to watch her fall down the stairs, but it's not as cringy because you don't hear her head thudding. That's still creepy because there's hands. See, I really don't think they're that scary without the sound. It's the dead silence that leads up to the sound that makes you anxious. It's like this sense of apprehension, this sense of something's coming. That's actually a horror trope in music. You know that something bad is going to happen when it gets quiet because the music went away, and that creates this higher sense of tension. I came across an article by a film fanatic who has grown to hate movie theater audiences, and he talked about the movie The Conjuring. He said something at the very end which I felt was very applicable. He said, "It's equally true that the film is far more terrifying now, 8 weeks in and playing to mostly empty auditoriums, than it was opening weekend, surrounded by people jostling, whispering, and chewing the whole damn time." I find this so interesting because in our horror film class, we were all watching together. We were a unit, and we kind of fed off of each other's responses. Music does that. The Conjuring was one of the movies that made us jump and scream and hide our faces the most. And that's because of the use of sound design in this movie. Because without that sound, it's not going to make you jump. Okay, so this is our last video. So let's watch me jump a little bit more. That wasn't too bad. See the loud sounds? It's the sounds that get you. I almost didn't even see the face. It's those loud sounds that like really make you jump. It's like a spike in your adrenaline. Oh. Okay, yeah. No, we're gonna go back and watch some of those again. But now it's just an open door and a woman dropping a baby monitor. That could be anything. That could be her baby's crying. That's still a little creepy because there's a face. But it didn't make me jump. That's also way less scary without the sound. Another quote from Neil Lerner: "Horror films' repetitious drones, clashing dissonances, and stingers, those assaultive blasts that coincide with shock or revelation, affect us at a primal level, perhaps instinctually taking us back to a much earlier time when the ability to perceive a variety of sounds alerted us as a species to approaching predators or other threats. So I think what these movies really play on, and what the sound and the music in these movies play on, is your animalistic instinct. So that fight or flight response is what they're trying to generate through the use of sound. And I think it's really interesting that horror movies really just aren't the same without the sound. So in conclusion, horror films and films in general would not be the same without soundtracks. And whether or not it's a soundtrack that's been written specifically for the movie, or the intentional omission of a soundtrack, or songs picked from current popular music, that soundtrack can either add or detract from the movie in a great way. And I think that's why horror films have become so successful, because the use of sound is something that affects people instinctually, because you can't cover your ears. You can only cover your eyes.